Good morning and good evening and afternoon and whatever time it is for the various people who are here and also the people who will be watching this later. I would like to welcome everybody to the beginning of our third webinar in the series on harvest strategies and management procedures. I'm Deirdre Warner-Kramer, and I'm going to be very happy to work with an excellent panel of presenters over the course of this webinar. I wanted to take a moment before we began to offer thanks to the important sponsors and organizers of this event. This is, of course, the third in the quarterly webinar series, as I'd mentioned at the beginning. These are all found on harveststrategies.org, which is an online clearinghouse for all things related to harvest strategies, management procedures, and all of the technical information around this. That is sponsored by the Common Oceans Project, a program of the FAO, which is funded by the Global Environment Facility. And so we are going to be delving into the issues that build on the two previous webinars, looking at harvest strategies holistically and essentially why you need to build out a full one and what are the benefits and pieces of that. But before we launch into the substance this morning, I wanted to note a few important logistics. We've all been doing this for a while, so I think everyone is well aware that everyone should please keep your camera off and stay muted unless you're speaking so that we can preserve the bandwidth. You'll note at the bottom in the Zoom application that interpretation is available in English, Spanish, and French. So you can find that as an option if you need it through the course of the webinar. We will be holding questions until the very end of the panel session. And that at that time, you can use the raised hand function if you want to ask a live question. But at any point throughout the session, if you have questions that come to mind, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit those questions, and we can look through those and pull them out at the end of the session as well. We would like to have a very active and interactive conversation with all of the people who have joined us today. We have a lot of information to cover from a lot of really experienced and smart people, and so it's important that we can leave some time for that. So I'm going to ask the presenters to be brisk and leave time for the interactive piece. A note, as you've probably seen also when you joined the Zoom, this session is being recorded and it will be available after the fact on the harveststrategies.org YouTube channel. I would like to just take a moment then after I've gotten all those logistics things out of the way and offer a few opening thoughts. As mentioned, this webinar is focused on essentially the across-the-board pieces. We've had focused conversations that were looking at how management procedures and harvest strategies were being implemented in a number of international fisheries, whether through the RFMOs or looking cross-cutting ways at tuna across the world. And those have delved into the implementation and how those things are playing out in specific circumstances. But the goal for the webinar here is to take that step back and take a look at why a fully fledged, fully built and tested management procedure is the gold standard, why we don't want just one piece of it, and why we need all of those pieces to fit together. And so we will be taking a look at first a cross-cutting view that looks a little bit at the history and the development of these tools. And then we will look in more detail at some of the individual aspects. And then I will come in at the end and offer some thoughts on how management procedures are implemented and how they fit into good fisheries management across the board. So with that, let me just take a moment to turn over to the plan that we have for today. And I would like to hand over to our first presenter, who is Doug Butterworth, who is going to offer us a very useful and very much on the spot perspective from the history of the development of management procedures and why they are indeed the gold standard for management. So Doug, I'm happy to hand the microphone over to you, and please take it away.
Thanks, Deirdre. And to comment that the convenient thing about pretending to be an Australian is at meetings like this, you can say good day and know that you are covering everyone instead of having to go through the whole list. What I've been tasked to do today is to take those three acronyms you're seeing, HCR, MP, and HS, explain what they are and give you a bit of an overview about them. So next, please, Shana. First, what are they? HCR is a harvest control rule. MP is a management procedure. HS is a harvest strategy. And next, what I'm going to do today is take you through the history behind these terms, how they came about, and what they've now come to mean, because in fact that meaning has changed over time. Next, please. Okay, I'm going to take you back before most of you were born to around about 1960, over 60 years ago. And that was about the time where the very heavy exploitation of the great whales in the Antarctic had reached and almost past its peak. And the IWC started doing something about it. But next, to fast forward to 1972, which was the date of the first UN Conference on the Environment held in Stockholm. And at that meeting, the IWC was strongly criticized for not doing enough about the whale situation. And indeed, a whaling moratorium was proposed. So next, what was the IWC's response? It was in that same year to launch what they called the International Decade of Cetacean Research, or IDCR. And a key component of the IDCR was set out to be the development of what was called at that time a management procedure as the basis to set catch limits that would be sustainable for whale stocks. Next. Okay, so on to what was called at this time, it was put in place, called by the IWC the New Management Procedure, NMP, in 1976. What this diagram shows in the blue curve, it's a plot of sustainable catch against population size on the horizontal axis. And the blue curve is the shape that was taken to apply at that time for whales. It gave the maximum catch at 60% of the pre-exploitation level. And the rule was very simple of the new management procedure, formula, if you like. It was that red curve. It said if you are above 60% of K, sorry, the axis isn't that accurate, you could take 90% of MSY. If you were below 54% of the unexploited level, you could take nothing, and you slid up according to the inclined line from that one level to the other. So that was the so-called harvest control rule, a formula, if you like, a set out in mathematics, if you like, below. And next, please, Shana. Just note that it's all very well to put that red curve on the screen, but if you're actually going to use it to do calculations, you need to know three things. You need to know what is your current abundance, you need to know what was your pristine abundance for that stock, and you also need to know what MSY is. So next, please. Well, it wasn't even 10 years on that the NMP was seen to have failed. And the reasons behind the failure were the question I raised a moment ago. If you're going to apply that rule, you have to know P and K and MSY. And how did you calculate those? And even if you did have a method to calculate them, that method was just one of numerous contenders, numerous assessments, if you like, to use language many of you will be familiar with. And the point was, but how do you know which of those methods is right? Another way of saying, how do you deal with the uncertainties? So next. So to quote a statistical colleague of mine, some very apt wording here, don't parameterize the world if you can't estimate the parameters. So conceptually, the NMP was fine, but then when it came to apply it, all sorts of further problems arose. Next. So the key point here is you can't just be conceptual. You've got to be able to use that glorious American term, operationalize any approach you're going to use to manage a fish stock. Next. So what was the IWC solution to that? It was to move to what they called at the time a management procedure approach. Note the word approach. So it was more than just the new management procedure of 1976. Next. So what in fact were the key problems when there were attempts made to apply the new management procedure? The first was typically P, K, MSY were calculated using what we'd call a best assessment. But as you went from one year to the next, particularly in circumstances where you didn't have much data, what happened? The magic number that came out of the NMP flew all over the place. It could go from 0 one year up to a large number the next year, up to something, but down to something between the following year. And that was no way you could practically manage a fishery. And you're still wrestling with the question, as fast as an assessment was put forward to be the basis to apply the NMP, the question arose, but what if that assessment is wrong? How confident can we be in the result that's coming out? So next. So I'd raise the general question here that this isn't just a problem for the IWC and whale management. It's a problem that applies to just about every fishery and the way most of the fisheries in the world are still managed. For instance, if you go to the US Magnuson-Stevens Act, I realize there are other reasons which complicate the application of management procedures in the US, which we may come to later. But basically, it's got the same problem. It's fundamentally specifying the harvest control rule without giving you the rest and addressing these two questions at the top of the screen. So next, please. So one must pose the question, it's now 4 decades since the IWC came to the conclusion that coming up with a harvest control rule alone wasn't enough. You had to go further. Yet that lesson doesn't seem to have been learned worldwide, even now. Next, please. So what did management procedures or the management procedure approach or management strategy evaluation, which is another term for it, what did they bring to the table that was new to solve the problem? Now, in fundamentals, next, what was behind all these new approaches was what's called feedback control. And what is that next? It's really the idea that you monitor changes in the stock by some means or other, and you adjust your management measures, which are typically total allowable catches, accordingly. Stock goes up, increase. If the stock goes down, decrease. Okay, so next, thanks, Shana. To be very brief here about the details, because John and the others will also enlarge on this as we go along. How it works is you start off by selecting some plausible models of the resource, assessments, if you like, that called operating models in this area. And it's just saying you could have more than one assessment that's totally plausible. The second point is you've got to make sure that any of those models are consistent with the data. Next. Then you've got to agree on some overall objectives and how you're going to measure whether being attained. Typically, they relate to catch variability and not risking dropping the resource too low. They could be wider. And next, please, Deirdre. Sorry, Shana. And the way you select your management procedure is you compare the various candidates, how they perform in terms of those performance measures, and you select the one that gives you the best trade-offs across the range of operating models, alternative assessments that gives you and you use that range to cover the uncertainty. So next. So what might a management procedure look like? And remember, it's no more than a formula. Next. And the formula can be simple. It's not always very simple, but it can be very simple. Next. For example, the formula could be as simple as next year's TAC will be 10% of the biomass estimated by last year's acoustic survey of the stock. And indeed, in South Africa, we have one MP that's fairly close to that. There are other bells and whistles, but the point is that's very simple and specifies exactly what you have to do to apply it. Next. So again, note the feedback control in that. If the biomass goes down, the TAC will go down. If the biomass goes up, the TAC will go up. So the TAC is being adjusted to try to stabilize the stock. Next. So what are the advantages? Again, very briefly, anyone who's been in an international RFMO scientific committee knows how long the haggling takes place each year to determine the TAC for a stock. This pre-specifies what you're going to do, so you save time. Next. Secondly, you can't really properly evaluate risk under the conventional approach. This procedure has built into it an approach that properly calculates its risk. Next. One thing the industry always wants to do is limit the extent of TAC variability from year to year. What this does is it gives you an objective method to be able to do that defensively, which you can't otherwise come up with. Next. It's basically by construction, looking at all these uncertainties, it's consistent with the precautionary approach. Next. It gives a framework for interacting with stakeholders, because when you come to choose that MP among various candidates, you can let stakeholders in to have them express what their preferences are, what they're looking for. Next. You save time because you lose that haggling every year about the TAC, and you can invest it in longer-term research to better serve the better management of the resource in the longer term. Next. In international terms particularly, it provides a default. There'll always be haggling internationally, but at least you've got somewhere to start with. Next. And just to get back to the terminology, what the IWC did, and remember they were starting from the new management procedure, they called this new approach the revised management procedure, or RMP. So they're still saving the term management procedure, but the RMP involves a lot more, as I hope you've seen, than the NMP did. So next. So just to summarize, first, harvest control rule. Next. It's a formula for setting a TAC, no more complicated than a formula. But the important message which the IWC learned over 40 years ago is that alone is not enough to be able to manage a stock. So next. And that's why the movement further to what is called now a management procedure. What it does, you've got to have the HCR, but it adds two important things. First of all, it adds the data you require to be able to apply that formula and calculate the TAC using the HCR. And next, what you've done, the formula just doesn't come out of thin air. The formula has got to be scientifically tested by simulation across a range of operating models to assure that it will give reasonable performance, even if your best assessment of the resource at the time turns out to be wrong. Next. So what about harvest strategy, which is the third of my acronyms? That's sometimes used as an alternative to HCR. It's sometimes used as an alternative to management procedure. In other contexts, it is used perhaps to mean something else. But in our context of management procedures for this seminar, I'd argue to avoid using the term harvest strategy. This ambiguity about sometimes it's meant as HCR, sometimes it's meant as management procedure is confusing. I'd advocate just stick with calling a management procedure an MP. And the other confusion that sometimes arises is around MSE, which is the Australian term. What happened, these two initiatives back in the 80s, there was an initiative in the IWC Scientific Committee and one at the same time in Australia. In Australia, we're calling it the process management strategy evaluation, and that sometimes confuses people because MSE is used interchangeably with MP. They're not quite the same. Essentially, management procedure is the formula properly tested with its associated data inputs. Management strategy evaluation is not the MP, it is the process for developing the MP. So that's it. Next one, please, Shana. Thanks for your attention, and I hope you found that useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doug. And indeed, thank you very much for that very useful overview in both the origins of the management procedure in the IWC's work, as well as the important distinctions on what we mean when we're really talking about a management procedure and what all of those components are. I'd like to now turn into a little bit more of a look at some of those details, and we can start things off now with John Walter, who is a scientist with NOAA Fisheries here in the United States. And he is going to talk about essentially the important fundamental building blocks of a management procedure, the objectives, the performance indicators, and what that management strategy evaluation piece is really all about. So John, looks like you have your screen up, and I will turn things over to you. Thank you very much.
Good day, everyone. Echoing the Australian greeting that works globally. I'm John Walter. I'm the Deputy Director for Science and Council Services at the United States National Marine Fisheries Service. I'm also the Chair of Western Bluefin Tuna Committee at ICAT's SCRS. I'll be talking about beyond the harvest control rule, management objectives, performance indicators, and the importance of management strategy evaluation, which is timely given that ICAT has just adopted a management procedure and all of its specifications finally in its 2023 annual meeting. And ICAT is also embarking upon a number of MSEs to develop management procedures for many of its other stocks. So the take-home message from my talk is that harvest control rules are simply one component of the fully specified harvest strategy or management procedure, that management procedures developed through management strategy evaluation address the full process before it goes into place. And that's really important that you address all of the components that go into the assessment, management, and tax setting process, in addition to what's going to happen in the future, specifying the things such as what we'll hear about called exceptional circumstance provisions, and that full process is simulation tested to work given many of the uncertainties we're going to have in the future. So why management procedures over our conventional approaches? And I think the key there is that a lot of the things that are likely to happen in the future, such as environmental changes, climate change, challenge the assumptions of our conventional stock assessments. And mainly that assumption that things are going to be stationary is going to be substantially challenged, as we're seeing with a lot of environmental changes. And that greatly complicates the ability of our stock assessments to estimate key benchmarks. It also means it's very difficult for them to project forward, which is usually the means of deriving catch advice from them. Also, there's much more explicit incorporation of diverse, often competing, or as yet unquantified management objectives through the management procedure development process in MSE. And that's also quite critical as we need to incorporate greater concerns from stakeholders. So a few necessary definitions. Unfortunately, there is a lot of jargon associated with MSE, and as Doug pointed out, that a lot of that is a little bit confusing because sometimes the words mean different things. Management strategy evaluation, as I think we've already gone over, is a means to develop a robust, consensus-driven, and realistic management procedure. It's an iterative process and usually involves substantial dialogue between scientists, managers, and stakeholders. The management procedure is the pre-agreed framework for setting that catch limits, designed to achieve specific management objectives. I call it essentially the recipe for setting the TAC. The management objectives are formally adopted goals for the fishery, and then performance statistics are the quantitative expressions of those management objectives, which are used to evaluate how well the management procedure is achieving its performance. These are also known as performance metrics or performance indicators. So to differentiate between the two things we're talking about, harvest or catch control rule, and in the United States, quite often we have many fisheries that are catch and release based fisheries. So simply harvest doesn't quite get to the management objectives because often releasing fish is an objective of the fishery. So catch control rules is what we tend to want to use the word because that encompasses both catch and kept and released fish. That catch control rule is usually something that throttles back fishing mortality on the basis of stock status. Usually that stock status is determined from a conventional stock assessment model. And on the left is a diagram, which is the classic Kobe matrix of where you are on stock status, and then the fishing mortality rate that would get throttled back based on that stock status. That is simply one component of the fully specified management procedure that's vetted through MSE. Catch control rule can either be in the same exact form as it is on the left, or it can be some other modification based on an indicator. But it's simulation tested through this feedback loop process in the diagram on the right. And so the management objectives for a fishery, conceptually, what you usually start out in terms of conversation with stakeholders are to ask conceptually, what are your desired goals for the fishery? Then a key component of that process is distilling those conceptual objectives down to operational, specific, codified, and measurable objectives with timelines and minimum required probabilities. A good illustration of that is conceptually, most fisheries want a stable total allowable catch that doesn't have substantial variability between TAC setting. Operationally, what does that mean? Well, it might mean that the TAC varies by less than 20% in each year. And so it's key to develop that operational quantification so that then we can evaluate how well our management procedures achieve that operational objective. A key component of the full stakeholder MSE is that it elucidates both the conceptual and the operational management objectives and their trade-off space because usually there's multiple competing objectives. So for Atlantic bluefin tuna, there were 4 primary management objectives. These are typically conserved across almost all fisheries management contexts. However, they sometimes change depending on the specific needs. They're safety, status, stability, and yield. The first 2 are the biological must-pays, and in most RFMOs and in most fishery management organizations, they are what must be met by management. It must have a reasonable probability of not overfishing, a reasonable probability of keeping the stock in the status that it's supposed to be in, and a very low probability of the stock falling below the thou shalt not go levels of a biomass limit reference point. I won't go into the details of exactly what those were for bluefin, but essentially the biological must-pays are relatively conserved across all fisheries management. The other 2 are stakeholder needs. They relate to stability of TAC, which we noted about TAC changes, and then yield, which is a primary consideration for all fisheries management, is to try to get yield both in the short term as well as in the long term. There are also multiple other management objectives that may come into play depending on the MSE related to socioeconomic wants or needs. Other objectives, and particularly in a lot of recreationally driven fisheries, then the recreational fishing opportunity, the opportunity to catch and release fish is often a key stakeholder desire. One of the things that's evident in all of fisheries management is that there are competing objectives. And I think that scientists often want to feel that the stock assessment and scientific process is divorced from politics. Unfortunately, that's not true. It is fisheries management and giving fisheries management advice, and particularly the decisions involved in fisheries management involve dealing with trade-offs. And it's about the allocation of scarce resources, which is politics defined. One of the best, about the only thing we as scientists can do is to quantify that trade-off space, bring those competing objectives to light, and then provide decision makers with that decision space. And in this case, the figure on the right is the trade-off space between catch of eastern bluefin tuna over the 30-year time period, the average catch, and western bluefin stock status. And if you're somewhat familiar with the bluefin tuna situation, there's two stocks, an eastern and western stock. They mix, so there's substantial mixing of the two populations, and many of the fisheries are on mixed stock fisheries. So what happens in one area of the Atlantic affects the other area. And so there's a fundamental trade-off between how much catch one could get out of one region and potentially stock status and the catch out of another region. That trade-off space can be kind of distilled down to the figure on the right, which is status in the west and catch in the east. You could catch more in the east, but it would come at the penalty of status in the west. These trade-offs are fundamental across nearly all fisheries management decisions. They involve, as I noted, commercial yield versus recreational opportunity for fisheries that have both commercial and recreational components. It's commonplace in our longline versus purse seine yields in many of our tropical tuna fisheries across the world, and particularly it's something that the case for multi-species interactions, or when we actually more fully incorporate ecosystem interactions. So by bringing those trade-offs to light, allowing that solution space to be clear and evident to decision makers, it gives them that information to make that trade-off decision. And what I've often said is that MSY, or the mythical view of what maximum sustainable yield is, or in the US, Magnuson-Stevens optimum yield, is really the solution space across those competing objectives. It's what we can live with. It's not something we're going to solve from our models because it's fundamentally dependent on on the decisions we make about those other objectives that affect that. A good case in point is that fisheries with different selectivity are going to affect the ultimate calculation of MSY, even in a single species stock assessment. So MSY is fundamentally a societal decision. The performance statistics for the bluefin MSE for status, we use where we are on the Kobe quadrant. Then for safety, we used lowest depletion, which is the spawning stock biomass relative to the dynamic spawning stock biomass over the projection period. I won't go into more of those details, but for each of the operational management objectives, we had at least one or multiple performance statistics. For yield, we actually had 3 mean catches in the first 10 years, the 30 years, and then something that was actually quite important decision making was catch in the first year of the management procedure implementation. This was indeed the catch that would be obtained by each management procedure, and it was quite important for us to quantify and show exactly what that was going to be, because for better or worse, a lot of decision making is short-term based decision making. However, and to not have provided that information would have not have provided the clarity that decision makers needed to have, because oftentimes they have to answer in the short term to their stakeholders. And then stability, which is the variation attack between management periods. And so this figure is a little bit complicated, but primarily what it illustrates is how the process can show and not just tell what those performance statistics were. And we were able to work decision makers through what the MSE was really providing, and that it had stochasticity built into it. So the performance statistics were calculated across multiple realizations of the operating models, and then how each of those performance statistics were calculated. And then what those multiple performance statistics allowed us to do was then to quantify those across the different management procedures. And in this case, we developed what we called quilt plots, which allowed on the figure on the right, for each of the performance statistics, we calculate the actual value of that performance across multiple different management procedures, then ranking them across within a column as to how they performed. And in management strategy evaluation, it's performance of the management procedure that counts. It's not necessarily how it performs. It's the best performing management procedure is the one that should be recommended to be chosen. This quantifies performance across those. We summarized these in a more summarized form and then gave decision makers a much more summarized view of what the top performing management procedures were. The ones that failed to meet those performance statistics were recommended to be removed, and that narrowed the playing field down to the top performing ones. And so to summarize a lot of the importance and value of management strategy evaluation, and I cite a paper here done by our National Marine Fisheries Service MSE Technical Working Group, which has a number of these recommendations. It's something that particularly the full stakeholder MSE is something that is really valuable to apply when there's really difficult policy decisions and heretofore intractable or unquantified competing management objectives. And a good case in point was for bluefin tuna, where we had not yet fully accounted for the trade-offs between the east and the west stock, nor had we actually provided management advice that fully accounted for mixing. There's a number of other really difficult policy decisions facing many of the world's fisheries, particularly between longline fisheries and purse seine fisheries for large and small tropical tunas. Another key time to employ that is when there's disenfranchised stakeholders. For instance, when stakeholders may not have a normal stake at the table and their needs and objectives may not be part of the decision-making process as it currently exists. A good case is the ecosystem where it's not usually formally addressed or accounted for. Third time is when the scientific uncertainty threatens the integrity of the status quo management. And it's when it's clearly failing, when there are known unknowns, when we know there are things that we're not accounting for. In this case, oftentimes environmental change is a key situation there. That becomes even greater and more existential problem when the future projections are really unclear. And in the figures on the right, those are the sea surface temperature increases for the Gulf of Maine and Gulf of Mexico, which are two of the most fastest increasing sea surface temperatures in the world, in global oceans. They're two of the most important areas for bluefin tuna. So that species is affected pretty substantially by increasing temperature, both in its key spawning and key feeding areas. How that's going to affect the population is really an unknown. And what the main thing we can give decision makers in that is that by accounting for those in the operating models that are tested through MSE and part of the management procedure, we can provide them management certainty for an uncertain future. And I think that's the best we can scientifically do because we don't know what's going to happen in the future. So the take-home messages is that harvest controllers are simply one component of a fully specified harvest strategy or management procedure. The management procedures developed through MSE address the full process before it goes into place, providing that management certainty for what is an uncertain future. And then why we would want to employ them, mainly because what's going to happen in the future is uncertain. And the best advice we can give is that we've simulation tested the management procedure to be robust to these certainties. And I think if I were a decision maker, I would want to know that what I put into place was likely to work, given what we think may happen. And then the fact that we've often not quantified competing stakeholder needs, and MSE provides that ability to bring those to light. So I'd like to acknowledge, particularly through the bluefin process, we had many ICAT colleagues who were integral to the communication of these materials and to the development of those communication materials that allowed us to effectively bring that information to decision makers. My colleagues in our NIMS MSE working group, as well as many of my other colleagues within my agency and my academic partners who've helped us put together these materials and information. So thank you.
Thank you very much, John. So we have now seen both the broad sweep of what these terms mean, And thanks to the presentation you've just seen from John, we now have a much better understanding of the different components that are at the base of what makes up a management procedure, in particular looking at the case study of bluefin tuna in the Atlantic and all of the different pieces that came into that, as well as some of the challenges and lessons that we learned in that. And we'll come back to some of those issues later. But now let's turn over from the structural pieces to the underlying elements that relate to data collection and the assessments and the science that is still an important component of what you do when you are implementing a management procedure. Moving away from the best assessment model doesn't mean that you are no longer doing assessments. It just means you need to calibrate the science that you're doing and the data collection that you're undertaking to meet the needs of the management procedure. So let me hand things now over to Drs. Rob Scott and Finlay Scott from the Pacific community. These are senior fisheries scientists who are going to provide a presentation for us looking more into those scientific aspects. Let me see if you are here. Excellent. Okay, I'll hand things over to you. Rob, looks like you've got the control.
That's great. Thanks, Deirdre, and good evening, everyone. It will be just myself today. I'm afraid Finlay won't be able to make it this evening. So as mentioned, this is a quick look into the, just to change that, I'll put my control. All right, okay. This is a quick look into the data collection plan and assessment methods that sit alongside the harvest control rule as part of a fully specified management procedure. And pardon me for a second, I'm just working out how to advance my slides. So a fully specified management procedure. A management procedure is a pre-agreed and tested procedure that determines the management action in a fishery given the status of the resource. And as Doug mentioned in his introduction, it's not just the harvest control rule. The harvest control rule on its own is not sufficient to really ensure that the stock is managed effectively and as intended. There's this estimation method or assessment method and associated data collection program that's required. So the harvest control rule typically takes as its inputs some estimate of stock status, and based on that estimate of stock status, it determines some level of fishing mortality. Some level of management action that's applied to the fishery. That estimate of stock status must come from some estimation method, and that estimation method must be informed by data to some extent. So the three of those components your management procedure, and they're agreed together as a package and tested as a package through your MSE evaluation process. So throughout this presentation, we'll just slightly unpack this estimation method and have a look at some of the issues around the data collection program associated with it. So the estimation method differs somewhat from the traditional stock assessment approach. Very often, or increasingly through the traditional stock assessment approach, you have a stock assessment model. It could be quite complex. Certainly within the WCPFC, where our assessments are quite new, those assessment models change almost every single time we run them, either in terms of the inputs to the model, the structure of the model, or its parameterizations. They're very rarely, if never, the same model that was run the previous time. We're also increasingly running ensemble approaches to those modeling approaches, where many models are run for each assessment, and the management action is derived from the average across some modeling approach. This differs from the management procedure approach, where your estimation method really is a single model. It's a single model with a single parameterization that critically does not change through time, and ideally should be a simpler, relatively transparent method. So those models fall into two sort of broad categories: empirical models, where that could be something like as simple as CPUE trends or the mean size of caught fish, or more complex stock assessment type models, model-based approaches that could be a relatively simple stock assessment model, like a surplus production model, or where necessary, a more complex stock assessment model. But the primary objective of that estimation method is to provide a robust and reliable estimate of stock status that can be fed into a harvest control rule and can be tested as part of the overall management procedure. So just looking at the empirical category of estimation methods for the time being, where these can be based on relatively simple, relatively unprocessed data, stuff like trends in catch per unit effort, or changes in the mean length of the catch. The advantage of these approaches is that they are conceptually simple, and they're relatively transparent in terms of the indicator of stock abundance. It can be clear that if catch per unit effort is increasing, then there's an indication that the stock is increasing. If the size of the fish in the catch is increasing, there's an indication that the stock itself is doing quite well. Where these methods have some disadvantage is that they are potentially vulnerable to greater variability in both in their outcomes and their consequent management outcomes. So the natural variability in CPUE and the sort of sampling variability associated with determining the size of fish can lead to greater variability in empirical estimation methods. Now, to some extent, this can be moderated with meta rules that might constrict the level of change that's allowable from one management period to the next. So constraints on the level of change in catch from one period can dampen down that variability. But another disadvantage is that although they're conceptually simple and fairly transparent in concept, their application is not always completely straightforward. And one example of this is something that we looked at initially for South Pacific albacore when we were trying to develop a management procedure and looking to really keep the process as simple as possible and as transparent as possible, and basing something on catch per unit effort. And the harvest control rule here was essentially the product of two scalars. The first scalar was based on the relative level of catch per unit effort. So you can see at the end of the time series, the relative level would give you your first scalar. I can turn my laser pointer on. First scalar, if that CPU was low, then you'd have a negative scalar, then the scalar would be positive. The second component of the harvest control rule related to the trend in CPUE over time. So that the gradient of the CPUE over the last 10 years was used to, again, specify a second scalar. If that gradient was negative, the scalar was negative, and if it was positive, the scalar was positive. And then the product of those two scalars was used to adjust catch levels up or down in the fishery. This didn't meet an awful lot of enthusiasm initially when it was first presented, partly because it's quite a departure from the management approach that's recognized and had been used for some time. But I think its main failing was that we really struggled to find a CPUE time series that gave an accurate indication of stock status, and that's really where the whole thing completely fell over. And it just proved too difficult with South Pacific albacore to get any kind of empirical estimation method, simply because of the variability and in CPUE and the lack of relationship between CPUE and stock abundance. So following that approach, we started to consider model-based approaches for the stock instead. Now, model-based approaches, they're based on some stock assessment model, ideally a relatively simple stock assessment model, where possible. They are computationally slightly more involved and therefore have an intensive testing process. But on the positive side, they can have lower variation in their management outcomes. We had some initial looks at very simple surplus production models, but have more recently settled on an age-structured production model, shown in the figure here, where the results of the age-structured production model are on the x-axis in relation to our simulated true biomass, and you can see here that the model has a relatively good record of showing high biomass when the stock is high and low biomass when the stock is low. And this is something that we're currently developing and working on. It's a bit of a work in progress at the moment. One thing you'll note is that towards the bottom here, there's a clear departure, and that the age-structured production model is clearly overestimating abundance at very low biomasses, which is clearly not ideal. One way to accommodate for that can be a simple shift in your harvest control rule. So by shifting your harvest control rule across to the right at those lower abundance levels, you can mitigate some of that bias that's apparent in the estimation method at those low biomass levels. And because the harvest control and the estimation method sit by side, they're selected and tested together, and they don't change, you can apply that approach to try to mitigate some of the biases that you might have in one of these components. Just a short note on some experience we had with trying to develop a management procedure for skipjack in the WCPO. The skipjack fishery is dominated by purseine. Purseine CPUE is particularly difficult to interpret. Skipjack are also a very fast-growing, early maturing species and show very little size differentiation throughout the population. So identifying any kind of empirical approach to estimating stock status was very challenging right from the outset. Looking then at the model-based approaches, it's very difficult, again, to get a stock assessment working for skipjack, and there's a strong reliance on tagging data for any of the skipjack models that are around at the moment. So there's no clear alternative to a full integrated stock assessment approach for skipjack, and for this reason we ended up with the slightly undesirable result of having multi-fan CL as the estimation model specified within the management procedure. And the significant disadvantage of that is that it's incredibly difficult to test it and to evaluate it through an MSE framework, and it required significant computing power to get that done. One advantage was that the MFCL formulation was already familiar to stakeholders, and gained some acceptance relatively quickly for that reason. But a downside is that it is somewhat similar to the stock assessment. It's a different implementation to the stock assessment. It's a single model. It's a very single parameterization of multi-fan CL, but it's still quite similar to the stock assessment approach, and it has incredibly long runtimes when testing. Another disadvantage of that is the data requirements required to put that assessment together. And just as a final slide, I'll pick up on some of the issues around specifying the data requirements necessary to run the assessment method. essentially, as you're running the management procedure, in reality, it should not change from each implementation. So when choosing an estimation method, some idea of the likelihood that you can continue to collect data and to support and inform that estimation method is an important consideration. And for that reason, within the skipjack management procedure, we clearly specify the data that are used as inputs to that estimation method, and some of the processing around it, and some of the likely risks associated with not being able to achieve those data in the future. So many of those data, the annual catch estimates, the aggregate catch and effort data, operational data, etc., are mandatory data submissions and are obligatory under the WCPFC data submission standards. But some other data sets, notably the standardized CPU indices and the tag release and recapture data, are subject to ongoing arrangements, to informal arrangements amongst countries, and in some cases dependent on continued funding. And one of the key concerns we have for the fishery is the reliance on the CPUE for the pole and line fishery, which is continuing to decline in sort of the key areas of the fishery. So these are all sort of things that need to be considered as when choosing your estimation method, and with the ability to continue to collect those data and to provide the information to the estimation method is an important consideration that feeds through into further considerations around the monitoring of the performance of the management procedure, and potentially into exceptional circumstances as well. So that was a very quick overview, a very brief look at the estimation method and the data requirements feeding into the management procedure that sit alongside the harvest control, and together all three of them constitute the management procedure. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. Yes, that was a brief but very meaty overview into a number of these core issues that are, again, all about what needs to funnel into the process of the management procedure, both in its initial design, but also are essential to keep the machine running. And the examples that were pulled in here from the Pacific show two different ways that can be done, but also the challenges that can come in both of those respects. The next aspects that we'll turn to is the question of what happens when that isn't working as it should. What happens when things come up that either weren't anticipated or were outside of the parameters, and those are the basket of things that we refer to as exceptional circumstances within the management procedure process. So I will turn over to our next speaker, but before I do that, just a reminder that if there are any questions that pop into your head as you are listening to these presentations, you can save them till the end where we'll have the Q&A, or please use the Q&A function that you see at the bottom of the screen to submit them in writing, and we can take them up when we get to the final portion of our webinar. So let me hand things over now to Anne Preece from Australia's CSIRO, who will talk with us in a little bit more detail about those exceptional circumstances and how that plays an important role in the management procedure process. Anne, I will hand it over to you. Excellent. We see your screen. It's all yours.
Thanks, Deirdre. Am I in? No, not quite. Am I in the slideshow mode for you now?
Not quite.
There we
We're
go.
still seeing the desktop. There we go. Yep.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Hello, I'm Anne Preece. I work at CSIRO in Tasmania in Australia. And I'm talking about exceptional circumstances guidelines and how they're a safety net component around a management procedure once it's adopted. And I just want to say thanks to the organisers too for inviting me to speak, and to those in the background who have got this organised tonight. Thank you. So what I'm going to talk about is the role of exceptional circumstances and the guidelines, how they work, and what and when to check, and an example and some common concerns. So the exceptional circumstances guidelines provide a safety net around the implementation of a management procedure. Just want to move something on my screen. Hang on a second. There we go. Exceptional circumstances are conditions or data that fall outside the range of uncertainties that the management procedure was tested against. Hang on, I'll just switch slides. Sorry about that. Yeah, so I'm talking about the safety net around the implementation of a management procedure. And so the purpose of these is to review any evidence that could make implementation of the TAC advice or whatever advice your management procedure provides, is if that advice is risky to the stock or fishery. So we're looking at the evidence. The guidelines provide a scientific process for developing appropriate management responses. So it is a process approach, and it provides transparency in the TAC decision making by the Commission. So it provides a sort of a trail of evidence for the decisions that are made. And looking at exceptional circumstances can be really useful in that they can also identify monitoring and data collection or research actions or activities that the Commission should be undertaking. And these exceptional circumstances provisions or guidelines sit outside of the MSE and the management procedure, but are essential for management procedure implementation. So exceptional circumstances are conditions or data that fall outside of the range of uncertainties that the management procedure was tested against. So there's sort of this checklist of 4 things. So any new information on the stock or the population dynamic parameters or the biology that's outside of the range that we considered during the MSE testing of the adopted management procedure, or any changes in fisheries or fishing operations, or the input data to the MP that are missing, have changed, or are outside of the range that we simulated in the MSE, or if the implementation of the management procedure is inconsistent in any way with the MP advice. So an example of that would be if the total catch is greater than or less than the TSC recommended by the management procedure. So the process that we're talking about involves 3 stages. Is it exceptional? So we evaluate the evidence. It's not just an ad hoc, I think there's something wrong here, let's not implement the advice from your management procedure. It actually requires evidence. So we examine that evidence to see whether or not it's exceptional. And an example of this is the event or whatever it is outside the 90% probability interval of the projections when you're testing the MP. We consider the severity of impact of exceptional circumstances on MP performance and implementation. So you may have an example, an exceptional circumstance that has a low impact. For example, a less depleted stock than you would expect is a positive impact. So it's the situation is better than you anticipated. So that would have, yes, it's an exceptional circumstance. It's something that you might want to look at in a bit more detail, but the impact of that is low because it's a positive impact. However, in contrast, an unexpectedly low CPE point in your series, that could possibly be a negative impact. So you would need to look into that a little bit further, and the impact of that would be considered a lot more severe, I would imagine. The next step in the process is consider your actions. So usually there's some time in the process of implementing management procedure advice. So in this time, you can request monitoring or data collection. You could trigger an earlier review than the management procedure had planned. So normally we have a planned timeframe for management procedure review. So you could say, well, we think there's something wrong, so we need to bring that forward. And as a last resort, you would consider change to the TAC, but this would only happen if there was a very high risk to the stock. So when to run this? I think that this should be run annually, and that's what I think most of the RFMOs that have exceptional circumstances provisions are doing. So this is an annual review of the evidence for exceptional circumstances, and you run through that checklist, and noting again that the changes to the MP advice should be avoided except in situations where that advice would pose a risk to the stock or the fishery. So these are some of the concerns, common concerns that we see when we're talking about adopting an MP and whether or not the form of the exceptional circumstances guidelines. And the number one question is how specific should those guidelines be? Should they be highly specified? My view is that no, they shouldn't. They're really intentionally not prescriptive, and that allows us to cover unanticipated events. So in contrast, the management procedure itself is highly specified, and the management strategy evaluation covers a really broad range of plausible uncertainties. So you should have covered most things that you think might go wrong in your robustness and reference set of uncertainties when you're testing your candidate MPs. But exceptional circumstances are there to capture the what-if scenarios, or the things that you're not really expecting, or as John called them, the unknown unknowns, perhaps. The other question that often comes up is, what happens if exceptional circumstances are triggered? Is that a catastrophe? Well, no, it's not really. You can use the MSE operating models and existing robustness tests to check the impacts of that exceptional circumstance. And you can request research, data collection, additional model scenarios to run that would inform further review. You would really try to avoid changing the TAC or whatever your management advice is from your MP. And you would document the issues and the decisions so that you've got this sort of trail of evidence of what you've identified and how you're going to handle it. So I've added here an example from southern bluefin tuna use of exceptional circumstances around our management procedure. And this is an example that I think will crop up in some cases, so I've chosen this one. And it's where we identified some changes in the population dynamics. So back in 2017, our stock assessment models had really evolved, and the population dynamics in those models were quite different to the models that we were using for the management strategy evaluation back in 2011. So this is where we have a really quite distinct stock assessment from MP and MSE operating models. We had added new data to those models, and that's what was causing the population dynamics to change. We had added close kin in 2014 and other things after that. And so what the new stock assessment models were showing was a improvement in stock status, and the projections were indicating that interim rebuilding target may be, that's our target for our management procedure, may have been reached much earlier or with higher probability. So there was a difference there. So yes, that triggered exceptional circumstances. So what did we do? We checked for the sensitivity, we checked, looked at what factors were influencing the optimistic projections to see if there was anything strange in those assessment models or anything that was negative in the old operating models. We looked at the severity and impact as part of that process of through the guidelines. we just determined that this was a positive exceptional circumstance because the stock was in better state than we had anticipated, and rebuilding looked like it was going to be quicker or with a higher probability. So that was very positive. All the sensitivity tests indicated that the rebuilding target would still be met as a sort of a minimum requirement. And we noted that the assessment model changes have because they're distinct from the management procedure, they have no impact on operation of the management procedure or the TAC calculations or the management procedure parameters or the management procedure input data. So all those things were unchanged and still operational. And that's because we have a very distinct assessment process where we can develop and try new things in the assessment model, and it has no impact on operation of our management procedure. So we thought that we were in a very safe space, and so the action was that there would be no change to the recommended 2018 TAC. So that was our decision back in 2017. So in summary, exceptional circumstances guidelines allow for an annual check on management procedure advice. Scientists evaluate the evidence, so it's an evidence-based process to determine if an issue is exceptional, and then the severity of impact and the actions. Changes to the management procedure recommended TAC or advice should be avoided, except in situations where the advice would pose a risk to the stock or the fishery. And the exceptional circumstances process provides for transparency and TAC decision made by the Commission. Thank you, and thanks to my CSIRO, CCSBT and IOTC colleagues for their collaboration on MSE MPs and reviews of exceptional circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. And indeed, the process of looking at exceptional circumstances within a management procedure is essentially the reiteration of all of the different pieces that came together in forming the elements and building the management procedure in the first place. As you noted, it is an exceptional, it is a essential safety net, but also an essential feedback loop, which is the theme for management procedures in general. So I will take the prerogative to start a presentation myself now to see if I can try to bring together many of the different details that we've heard here on how management procedures are built and what a fully fledged process should look like, and all the different components, and try to put that in the context of how that actually needs to look when you are implementing it in a real fishery. And so let me take a moment to share my screen. Okay. So when apologies. I assume that you don't see all of the distracting bits that are up on the screen for me. There we go. All right. So when we want to talk about putting this all together, the key thing is that at the end of the day, a management procedure is a management tool that gives you an important element of how you are going to be managing your fisheries, and really the fundamentally the thing you need at the basis. But it is not something, of course, that stands alone, that is all you need. So once you've adopted your management procedure, you can congratulate yourself and you can say, we're all good here, right? And indeed, that is for all of the reasons that we've heard in the seminar today, an important and essential way of essentially building a better way of identifying what your total allowable catch should be and being able to take into account all of those things that we've heard all the other speakers note, including things like future-proofing and being responsive to reality. But as anybody who's done improv or been around anybody that has done improv knows, the answer to this question is, of course, yes, and never but. And that is that there's always more, and there's always new things, or there's always additional elements that are fundamental to being able to build this all out. And all of this is really a part of what we'd call good fisheries management 101, all of the basics. The management procedure at the end of the day is designed to spit out a TAC, a total allowable catch, that you implement on an annual or a multi-annual basis. That is the number of catch. But of course, when it comes to fisheries management, just having the number of how many fish or how much weight you want to take out of the water is only a small piece of the puzzle. When you look at that number, you need to figure out, well, how are you going to be allocating it? Allocating it in a whole lot of different ways, whether that is among countries or fleets or gears, sometimes even over time periods. How are you monitoring it? We heard an extensive presentation on the questions around data collection and the assessment piece of that, but you need other aspects of monitoring as well. How are you dealing with the related issues? When you're dealing with a directed fishery and trying to manage a directed fishery, that fishery doesn't exist in isolation. And as we also heard in some of the presentations, there are important components related to the management and impacts on the broader ecosystem. But it's more than that as well. And finally, how do you make sure that you have a management regime in place that is going to help you keep your management procedure healthy? How do you have the right kinds of feedback loops? How do you have the right kinds of information? How do you have the right kind of cross-checks to determine if things like exceptional circumstances are happening? So I'm going to take a look into each one of these in a little bit more detail as a way of highlighting the way that the feedback loop on these pieces of management also are important for your management procedure. When it comes to allocation, allocation is a broad term that covers a number of different aspects. When you're looking at a fishery, it is very, very rare that you have a fishery you are managing where there is a single gear type, a single sector who are going out and catching a single stock. Instead, you are often dealing with complicated situations, in particular in what we've seen in the perspectives here that are looking at management procedures implemented through RFMOs. You not only have a number of different gear types, you have a number of different types of fisheries that are occurring for a given stock. You have different countries and different fleets that are targeting those. So you need to deal with and have an effective, well put in place allocation regime. Because at the end of the day, a total allowable catch can't be fully implemented if there is no clarity on who gets what within that overall number. It sounds quite basic, but it's also really important when you're looking at things like the design of the management procedure. One of the core things that you need at the very beginning of a management strategy evaluation is to develop the different operating models, the different representations of plausible reality. And those are inherently going to need to have some information about what are the different gear types, what are the selectivity, what are the, how are these catches being allocated, and are those stable or are they changing? Is it something that might be very difficult to control from one year to the next? And then the other really important question when it comes to allocation, of course, is we're talking about allocating catch when we talk about a total allowable catch, but there is often, for a number of management reasons, a management will want to take a look at issues related to effort. And obviously, when you're talking about allocating total allowable catch, there are a number of different ways you can do it. But one of those things is an effort allocation. It can be limitations on days or limitations on types of vessels. And how do you translate that into the total allowable catch number and the process that you have established in your management procedure? All of these things, of course, are management choices. And when we heard John's presentation, he used that magic word, which is, of course, the question of trade-offs and management objectives. So all of the things that we're talking about here in terms of the components of what you need beyond the management procedure are at the same time also core components of the management procedure. And moving on to that, the other element of management, of course, is not just throwing everything out there and saying, here are the rules, but you need to know, how are those rules being implemented? How are the fisheries being monitored? We heard already a lot about the important elements related to data collection and how are you collecting data, but more importantly, how are you determining what data is most important, what data is most relevant, and how reliable is the data that you are receiving. Many management procedures, as we've heard, are empirical. They are based on essentially an input from particular data streams. And so you need to know what data you're going to be able to receive to fill that stream. Others may require different types of data, or they may be built in ways that recognize the unreliability or the erratic nature of the data you might be receiving. And if that's the case, then you have to design your management procedure to be able to take that into account. But then, of course, you also need to know, how are you doing in terms of implementing that total allowable catch that is being spat out as a result of the management procedure? Are catches generally in line with the total allowable catch? Are they higher? Are they lower? Is it across the board, or are different fleets, different gear types having different outcomes when it comes to the compliance with the existing rules? And then obviously beyond all of that, this is all within the framework of looking at an enforcement regime and understanding where there are issues around compliance, where there is IUU fishing, which often can't be quantified, but having the structures in place to try to minimize the amount of fishing that is outside of the system and that is unquantifiable is an important aspect of good fisheries management, but it's also an essential part of being able to tweak and maintain these management procedures. And then finally, you have the questions around how you manage the related issues. What about things like bycatch? If you're managing a directed fishery, but the directed fishery is using a gear or in an area or in a mixed species fishery that is resulting in a lot of bycatch, you may have additional management measures you want to put in place in addition to the TAC that is coming out of your management procedure. And again, these are all things that need to be built in from the start in the design of the management procedure, but they're also things that can be changeable or that can be different management priorities and might not be necessarily originally taken into account in designing what your management objectives might be. You might have situations where there are needs for developing time and area closures, either to protect spawning areas or because of other related activities that are not necessarily directly connected to the directed fishery. But those are also important elements of strong fisheries management, and they need to be thought about in a holistic way over top of the management procedure and the harvest control rules that you are putting in place under it. And then finally, I think it was John's presentation that noted that the ecosystem is an important stakeholder, but of course we have the actual stakeholders and the socioeconomic elements that managers need to take into account when they are designing management measures are often things that go beyond essentially the data and the science and the process that you're building here. There can be a number of different management objectives that are keying into things like dealing with fishing communities, dealing with stakeholders, balancing a number of different overall management priorities. And those are going to be elements that are part of your overall fisheries management regime that may be outside of the specific things you're implementing through the management procedure, but again, are essential parts of how all of this fits together. And keep coming back to that point in the feedback loop that most of these things should have been taken into account when the management procedure was designed in the first place, so that your management objectives and the statistics and indicators that you're looking at are reflecting those priorities and those additional management considerations. But if they're not, then they need to be put in place and taken into account into the future. And that all then feeds into the question of how do you make sure that you have a system of broader measures in place that will keep the management procedure healthy. And we've talked about the data piece. We've talked about the importance of being able to have the kinds of monitoring in place that can help you see where certain kinds of exceptional circumstances are occurring. But also, as I was noting, a number of these management objectives and aspects that are outside of the management of the directed fishery are also things that should be part of the broader management objectives and part of that conversation on the trade-offs and priorities and outcomes that are inherent to the design of the procedure in the first place. But there are often times that those are anticipated in the beginning, and either things change or things come to light. How do you start to understand where the trade-offs that you may have made in the beginning aren't necessarily healthy anymore? And in the process of reviewing the management procedure and potentially tweaking or adjusting it in the future, how do you have the feedback loop so you can understand that? And all of this is also an important part of that other fundamental building block of a management procedure, which is being able to have that essential dialogue between stakeholders, managers, and scientists to ensure that there is the feedback loop that you need to design a strong and effective management procedure and to keep it on track. And the better that you can design a system that engages all elements of that chain in the management process, the more likely it is that you'll build a strong management procedure that will be part of a healthy and effective sustainable fisheries management program overall. And so all of these things come together in the process of both gathering the information that you need, communicating the information among the different components of the process, and continuing to adjust and revise as you go forward. It is important that you have the processes in place to be able to gather and verify the data that you need and to understand which data is essential. So you need to have that reliable data. It needs to be relevant and it needs to be robust. You need to have monitoring in place so that you can understand that, or you can control the catch and ensure that the catch that you are actually realizing at the end of the day is in line with the total allowable catch that you've established. Or if you don't have the full ability to control the catch, then you at least need to have a sense of how much you are not controlling the catch so that that can also be built into the process. You need to ensure that this is all focused in a process that looks at not just the directed fishery, but all of the other elements of an ecosystem approach to fisheries management, whether that is dealing with the effects of the marine environment, the effects of the marine environment on the fishery and changes that may be happening there, looking at the other related species and interdependent aspects of the ecosystem, as well as, of course, the other creature that's part of the ecosystem, which is humans, and being able to incorporate those socioeconomic factors. And then finally, you need that constant feedback that comes from a robust management process that gives you a good sense of what the reality is. The reality both on the water, what is happening in the fishery, what is happening in the ocean, what is happening in the actual conduct of the fishery, but also the reality of what are the priorities and the needs of managers, of stakeholders to ensure that the management procedure is robust and is responsive to those needs and to those trade-offs. So all of these things need to fit together, but they also create that feedback loop, that each of these things needs to be part of what you are designing from the beginning. And then also you need to be able to create a process that you can continue to build and refine that as you go forward. One of the things I was asked in taking a look at this particular part of the seminar was to see if there were good examples that would highlight why having a fully fledged management procedure where it is robust and tested is better than just having a harvest control rule. But the reality is we've already heard all those examples in the presentations that we've had today, starting with Doug's from the very beginning and the experience of the IWC, that just creating some kind of harvest rule doesn't give you everything that you need. And in fact, there are very few, if any, within the RFMO context that are actually just looking at devising rules without devising the fully fledged management procedure. And the understanding is quite clear because you need all of those different aspects. So with that, I think I will pause my own presentation. We have heard a whole lot of very excellent information from our presenters. I'm sure that all of you have some questions that you would like to ask us. I need to make my full screen go away so that I can see everything else. All right. Thank you for that moment of technical adjustments. Too many windows open in the Zoom at the same time. So what I'd like to do right now is to open the floor for any questions that we have from all of the people who have come to join the webinar today. Please use the raised hand button on the bottom if you'd like to ask any questions of any of our presenters on the information that you've heard today. And I'll pause right there to give everybody a moment if they have some questions to go ahead and ask them. All right. I see the first question here is from Christine Burtz. Please, you should be able to unmute and go ahead and ask.
Hi, yes. So I'm curious, Rob mentioned some of the models needing more computing power and taking a long time. This kind of raises a broader question of the trade-off between how many different models you run and the human time that you have existing in the world. I was wondering if you could talk sort of more broadly about the time inputs with developing some of these procedures and how that impacts decision making and what models to test. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I don't know that I have any sort of real clear definitive answer to that. But we do find that for some of the models that we're looking at, the testing time is really really very high indeed. And the only way that we can do it is by using sort of condor flocks and off-site computing resources where we can farm out evaluations and simulations to a huge number of machines. So clearly, it's not ideal to have really quite large sort of lengthy runtimes in those evaluations, and the more that you can simplify your estimation method and make it much more simpler, it has a number of advantages. Firstly, it reduces your runtime and reduces the amount of computing power that you need to use. But it's also a more transparent and more easily interpreted by stakeholders and other members, and easier to try to see exactly how the management procedure is being implemented and what's influencing the ongoing management of the resource. So I don't know if anybody else has any sort of strong recommendations on what is acceptable and what's not acceptable. In our case, we've really found that we had no alternative other than to use this really quite sort of computation intensive approach, and that forced us to go to and we're just very lucky that we've been given access to these sort of quite significant computing resources at the University of Wisconsin, where we make extensive use of their condor flock.
Thanks for that question. I saw a hand that had been up previously, but looks like it's down now. It was Nick Dupre. Yeah, hands back up. So Nick, go ahead.
Thanks for that. And thanks to everyone for excellent presentations today. It's been really engaging. I had a follow-up question on exceptional circumstances that for Anne, I wanted to ask about a really good point she brought up in terms of not being too prescriptive with exceptional circumstances. And I think this can be a big challenge when they're being drafted as part of management procedures. And I was wondering if perhaps she may have some advice on how you navigate one person's prescriptiveness, which may be interpreted by others as vagueness. Like, how do you find that balance of drafting exceptional circumstances that have enough information for guidance to those doing the reviews, without trapping those reviews into only looking at particular items? And hopefully she understands what where I'm coming from. Thanks.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, it's a dilemma to people are really concerned about that, how prescriptive it is, and that they're urged to be more prescriptive. So that I think that the desire is to stop the fiddling with the TAC advice or your management procedure advice. But I think the categories that I set out, and they're pretty similar across the RFMOs, the exceptional circumstances guidelines that people have been developing. They're more or less the same. I think those categories sort of touch on everything that we're thinking is required for that MP to run successfully. So you can actually discuss with people examples. So if they're concerned about a new member joining your commission and a whole new fleet joining in, you can discuss which aspect that would get picked up in and how you would handle it. So I think that's my way of reassuring people that it's prescriptive enough that you can come to a conclusion, and it really is a documentation process, which I think is really one of the most valuable things. And the other part of it is the identification of research that needs to get done when something crops up, like, IUU is a classic one where it's so hard to quantify that you're making vague statements about whether or not it's actually happening. So how do you handle that? You're looking for evidence. So is there any evidence? And if there's not, what are you going to do about that? What's your commission going to do about that? They really need to think about mechanisms for detecting IUU rather than just guessing about it. And sorry, commission or governing management body. Thank you. I hope that was useful.
Thanks for those great questions and for the answers. While we see if any others have some questions, maybe I can take the liberty of throwing a question over to Doug, who kicked things off for us today. He noted in his presentation a lot of really great information on sort of the history of where the approach that we now embody within the management procedure came from. And we've seen that as we've had the presentations today, that's been fleshed out. And the practice now and the best practices now include a number of different key elements that weren't even really on the table in the beginning. And Doug, maybe ask you a question that's a little bit more forward-looking as you are taking a look at where we are right now and with your experience in working on management procedures. What are some things that you think are still out there that need to be fully developed, or any developments or improvements in this process that you'd like to see over the next, say, 10 years?
Thanks, Deirdre. It's rather difficult answering that following Rob's presentation, because Rob, I sympathize with you with the complications you've had to deal with particular stock you were describing and immense computing necessities. In that case, it's the only way you could go. But in most cases, I think you've really dealt with an exception there. In most cases, they're really, in my mind, simpler. And I think people would find, if they took this process properly on board, that they could in fact manage their fisheries much more simply by using indeed what Rob started out with, which is the empirical approach. The empirical approach for management procedures is one that is well received by stakeholders because they understand what's going on. They don't like black boxes generally. And the spirit of the IWC's original approach was not was to get away from the highly complex assessments and so forth. And in many cases, though the empirical approach can give you problems of variance, a lot of noise, in many cases it doesn't. And I'd encourage people to look more at that. And what I'd like to see in the next 10 years is a greater adoption of this approach, which does have its other problems. We haven't gone into it in detail today because they're technical aspects of implementation. But I think in the great majority of approaches, a simple empirical-based management procedure approach could see us doing much better and more time efficiently, both internationally and locally, than is the case at present. I hope, Deirdre, that's given you at least a beginning of a response to your question. Thanks.
Thanks, Doug. That is a good beginning. And I'd like to once again invite any of the participants here, if they have additional follow-up questions, to feel free to ask them. Pause for a moment and see if anyone has anything. While we're waiting to see if others have questions that they're formulating, maybe I can throw one over to John. John, you talked a lot about the example of dealing with Atlantic bluefin tuna, which of course has its own complexities, given that Atlantic bluefin tuna is made up of two stocks and certainly long-standing management regimes that treated each of those differently. And you noted that that was one of the key complexities that came up in the process along the way. But then the complexities in looking at a multi-stock MSE and dealing with developing a management procedure for multi-stock situations, I can imagine that would be even more complicated. And so I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about what that process can look like. How do you balance management objectives? And what does that need to look like from both the scientific
Sorry, Deirdre, you trailed off right at the end.
I said just from both a scientific and a management perspective, how does that additional level of complexity affect the process, and in particular, how you can balance the different management objectives?
Scientifically, it is challenging, particularly because Atlantic bluefin tuna probably has some of the highest volume of tagging, genetics, stock composition information available, which also raised the bar for including all of that information in the operating models. Probably to good effect, however, it made it scientifically really challenging, particularly because a lot of that information was coming in during the development of the MSE. So we were getting new information and new insights as the process of building the operating models was happening. I would say that in most situations, we would not have that volume of information, and we'd have to abstract a lot of those dynamics into, but they would be no less important for other situations where mixing is a key component. It certainly adds complexity to the scientific process of building and conditioning operating models. From the management side of things, I think that it's rather critical, because otherwise you're assuming that those dynamics aren't important when you have single stock management and there is mixing. And I think that's where it's challenging, because originally it seemed like the trade-offs might be zero-sum games between an east and a west, or between two different kind of different stakeholder groups. And the same thing applies to like long-line purseine fisheries. If you take from one, you steal from the other. And I think that the trade-offs weren't that clear-cut, black and white. They're also, once you showed what those trade-offs were, and I think that was the key in being able to quantify them, extract numbers from the operating models, that you could show people that that space wasn't such a scorched earth space, that they could find that middle ground. In fact, they've been living in that middle ground for many years already, because the management is inextricably linked anyway. We're just quantifying it and making that very explicit. And I think that once managers see that, they see that that's a space they can operate in, and that we can find the societal compromise that we've actually always found for many of these fishery management decisions. We're just a little bit better informed in finding that compromise space. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, again, the issue of trade-offs and balances is so inherently part of this process, but it also isn't exactly a new part of this process. Working those trade-offs has always been an essential piece of management of different kinds of fisheries. The difference here is that we're trying to quantify them and make them a little bit more front-loaded. But I think those are really important observations. Rob, maybe I'll pitch a question over to you. Doug, in his answer to my question to him, very clearly came out with a message of support for empirical management procedures as being the better way to go in most cases. But maybe I'll ask you a question, which is, are there any guidelines or senses that you can share on where a model-based or an empirical assessment method and the resulting harvest control rule would be more appropriate for a given management procedure? You gave us 2 examples in your presentation, but I wonder if you could contextualize that a little bit to see if there are any guidelines on where one might be truly a better fit than another.
Thanks, Deirdre. Yeah, I'll try, but I think as a really following from what Doug and agreeing with Doug's comments, I think that the general recommendation is to keep it as simple as you can to the extent possible, and the more simple you can keep it, the better it is for a number of reasons, and only really move to those more complex approaches where you really have to, or where you find you have no alternative. So I guess it really comes down to looking at the information that you get and the data that you get, and trying to find out how can you get a really good signal, or a really reliable signal of the status of the stock. And one of the challenges that we certainly face is, for some of the stocks that we're looking at, we don't see very much historical variability in that stock. So you see very flat CPUE, sort of very flat stock status, and it's very difficult to know if you've got a reliable index of stock status or not, coming out of the information that you have available. I guess there's a couple of things in the pipeline that might be quite interesting to sort of monitor and see how they follow through the Pacific region. There's an increasing uptake of electronic monitoring, and that could be a source of additional information that helps in sort of preparing those sorts of indices and developing those sorts of indexes of stock status and relative abundance. But it might also come down to an issue of just scale as well, where you're trying to manage really quite wide scale, very broad stocks. It can be quite difficult to get an empirical index of abundance, and where you're dealing with perhaps smaller stocks or much more targeted and much cleaner fisheries that really have a less of a multi-species component to them and less of a mixed fishery aspect to them, then it can be easier and to develop those indicators of stock status without going to more complex modeling approaches.
Thanks. I think the key message of keeping it simple and taking a look at what is truly doable, those are certainly pieces of the puzzle that we're hearing loud and clear from you and from some of the other speakers this morning. I've gotten a question in the chat that I will share, and I will actually take a first stab at trying to answer part of it, but then I'm going to throw it back out to the panelists to see if they might have some perspectives. And the question is coming from Dave Shalit, who asks, with regard to the idea of incorporating IUU in a management procedure, how does one quantify the unquantifiable, which is, of course, one of the great challenges that we have right now in fisheries management across the board. Let me offer a few thoughts on that to begin with, which is that when it comes to estimating and understanding the extent of IUU fishing, there are a whole lot of different ways that different researchers and different managers have tried to do this over the years. One of the important ways that you can do it in international fisheries is often by looking at other elements of fishing versus that go beyond just essentially recorded catch statistics. You can use different kinds of tools that can estimate levels of effort, that can try to identify vessels that appear to be engaging in the fishery and trying to correlate that with some degree of catch or fishing effort. You can use things like trade statistics to try to understand where you're seeing products in trade that don't necessarily correlate with what you have from catch statistics. But the methodologies for estimating this are, of course, still very much nascent. There have been a number of attempts to do this in either the small scale, looking at particular fisheries, or in the larger scale, looking at wider regions or even globally. And there is work happening right now through the UN Food and Agriculture Organization to essentially try to nail down solid methodologies, at least best practices on methodologies for identifying IUU fishing. But that remains a general challenge across the board. But the question on how you incorporate this within a management procedure, because that is something that is a real existing situation in a number of the fisheries that are currently either already under a harvest strategy right now, or are the different international bodies are working to get there. Maybe I'll throw this one to the panelists to see if they have some ideas on that. Doug, it looks like your hand is up, so I can hand it over to you first.
Chair, my hand was up for a totally different issue I'd like to raise, but I think in broad terms, you've essentially covered the answer to that question. Thank you.
All right, well, thanks. And I'll come to you next because I see that Nick's hand is up and he may have another question for us.
Thanks, and sorry to throw out another question, but I'm sort of curious what the panelists, where they are in terms of, once you have an MP that's fully specified, kind of what's next, right? What do we do after that? Now we have the MP and it runs, but typically I think so many scientists, stakeholders, managers are used to, when an assessment happens, everything gets relooked at. And so in an MP format, that's not really the purpose, is every time to run the MP is to redo the analysis. So at what point should the scientists begin looking at these things again, looking at the operating models, looking at retesting the management procedure to make sure it's doing what it's supposed to? And I know a little of that's covered in exceptional circumstances, but I'm thinking more along the lines of almost a full retesting of the management procedure via MSE. And I think any of the panelists probably have some experience, maybe some more than others, in in that world of when do you start opening up the analysis again? And I'm curious about their experience there and how they communicate that to everyone as well as when that should happen. Thanks.
Thanks, Nick. What a great question, because of course, one of the key things about the management procedure process is that it's supposed to be essentially dynamic and responsive, but how do you determine how often you're going to be doing that kind of comprehensive review? I know, Doug, you had your hand up for a different issue, so maybe I'll see if Anne has an initial answer to that question from Nick.
Thanks, Nick and Deirdre. Yeah, for southern bluefin tuna, we chose to build into our sort of processes of implementation of the MP that we would do a review after 6 years, which is after about 3 decisions, TAC, just blocks of 3 years of TAC decisions have been made. So, and that time frame was chosen partly because it wasn't too long, but also it was a time frame within which we should actually see some impacts of the management procedure on the stock status, so on our rebuilding plan. So that helped identify that timing. I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks, Anne. John, your hand is up in response to this question.
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. I think it was clear in the Atlantic process that stakeholders from every place needed to see what the timeline for all of the events that would occur, and considering reconditioning as well as what a new stock assessment process would look like, and that we would continue to do stock assessments as status or health checks. And I think that surety was critical to getting buy-in across the groups. I mean, just speaking for stock assessment scientists, they were often worried, are they going to be out of a job? And I think the answer is no, not at all. There's still going to be a need to assess the status and to revise the models that we use to do that. So having that surety as to what is going to go on in the process, but also negotiating the timeframes to be something where, as Anne said, you would actually see some impacts, be able to conduct the necessary science to be able to incorporate those, and then fit that into all of the other competing needs in an RFMO was key. But that timeline really helped. And as we present that timeline to illustrate the process, it really begins to resonate to people that, oh, this is something that actually could work for us. This is not just set it and forget it forever. And so I think that's really a key point. Thanks.
Thanks, John. I think that last bit you said is an important one, which is that this needs to be something that is also clearly articulated as part of that process and part of that feedback loop, figuring out how often these reviews will happen so that that's clearly understood. But the challenge is also, as we've seen, for instance, with Northern Albacore, in the ICAT context, that each time we've reset the TAC, we've actually made some tweaks to the process without doing the full review. And that can often be essentially a diagnostic that lets you know that maybe something wasn't quite right the first time around, and it's time to take another look at it. So Doug, let me hand over to you. You may have some observations on this question, and then you also had another point you mentioned you wanted to raise.
Thanks, Deirdre. In fact, the question links fairly well with the point I was going to make. First, to pick up on what Anne and John said, I think in every case where I'm aware of a seriously considered management procedure being put in place, there is a specified period for review. And it goes, the periods run from, I've seen run from 4 to 9 years. The 9 was SPT, which came down later to 6. But in South Africa, we used 4. In the IWC, they used 5. In ICAT, then SPT, they're using 6. ICAT for BFT. For NAFO, green and halibut, they're using 6 as well. I think all the reasons Anne has given. It's primarily people are nervous about committing to something for too long, and they do want another look to make sure everything is on track. There's another important principle here. When you go through a management procedure evaluation to come up with an MSE, an MP, what that procedure will show you is what are the key uncertainties, what is the part of the dynamics you understand least and is leading to you having to, because of the poor understanding, leading to you having to be particularly conservative. That provides you the basis to focus your research over that intervening typically 6 years to say, how can I understand that better? And as a result, come out when I do the review with a different trade-off. Chair, you talked about trade-offs of trade-offs, the changing your trade-off. And the procedure is supposed to help you in that process. So it's not that you suddenly stop. What it does is point you to where is the most important place to focus your research so that you can come to a more effective utilization of the resource, having done that further research. Now, where does this link with what I was going to say? Because what I was going to say, in fact, links to this review period. Again, I think it's important to learn from history, and hopefully the mistakes people make, others realize and make sure they don't repeat them. And again, the fact that the IWC was the first to take this route, and as I explained later, they discovered the first mistake was you can't just rely on a harvest control rule. They made another mistake. And it was bitterly, sort of fairly bitter process to recover from that, because we're used to, in RFMOs particularly, a space of a week, where in that week you have to get the data together, you have to come up with an assessment, you come with a recommendation for TAC, and it's implemented at the following commission meeting, and it's all a very quick process. Now, in the period of that process, you can't get any more new information. The MSE process, developing an MP, takes longer. And the big problem with that is when the process takes time, new information comes on the table, new information that wasn't taken into account in the original operating models. And you get a request to go back to the beginning again and start it all over again. Now, the IWCs learned bitterly from that, with one of their first attempts taking 20 years to go through that iteration I've just described before they got something together and eventually said, right, there we have the operating models, and here we have the suggested MP for this particular stock. And the solution to that was very brutal. It says, in future, we're not going to have this again. We're going to make sure that there are two guillotines. First of all, there's a guillotine for data. When we start the process, we'll accept some data, and we will not accept any more data until we've finished it, because it's not a problem. We can take that new data into account in the review process, however many years on it is, 5 years. The other aspect of it is they had the same rule for operating models. They said, having got the data, we will use that data and agree what are the alternative assessments that are compatible with that data, and we'll draw a guillotine on that. We will not typically, for the IWC, within a year of accepting the data, we will accept what the operating models are for this case, and then they will take it through to conclusion and adopt an MP. And we will get this done within a reasonable time period, where the IWC ideally has a schedule set up for 2 years to do this, which is pushing it if it's a first attempt, but is certainly practical for later attempts. And the key point about this is it's not a problem that you put these guillotines on, because you have the review process down the line. Things are not going to go belly up because you've done that within that review period for 2 reasons. A, when you review, you'll be able to look at these things again, take more data into account. And number 2, Anne's expression, you always have exceptional circumstances. if something is going belly up, you have a process to, and one of the actions with exceptional circumstances is bring your review forward for 6 years, from the 6 years. Start it earlier. So I would like to emphasize that because it is a lesson that was very hard learned in the IWC. And I think people need to be aware of this problem and to be aware of the IWC solution to it. Thanks.
Thanks, Doug. Very important points and actually very nice ones to end on, kind of coming full circle from the beginning presentation, where we heard how much of this grew out of the struggle that the IWC had, and we can end now on those important lessons that have been learned in that context. So let me take a moment here first just to thank the excellent panelists for both the wonderful presentations that they have offered, but also the great discussion that we've had here and the additional points and insights that they've brought forward. Thank you to everyone who has joined us for this webinar. A reminder that it will be available through the Harvest Strategies YouTube channel. If you had to duck out for coffee at any point or want to see the rest of it, you can find it there. Let me also take a moment to note that the next of the quarterly webinars is planned now for April, and it's anticipated to cover a preview of what we expect to be happening in the 5 tuna RFMOs when it comes to harvest strategies over the course of 2024. So watch your email and watch the harveststrategies.org webpage for more details on that. I'd like to also just reiterate my thanks to the sponsors and the organizers of this, in particular, John Borges and Shana Miller from the Ocean Foundation, who have been instrumental in organizing all of us and working everything in the background to make sure that it went so smoothly. And thanks again to the Common Ocean Program from FAO, who sponsors and makes this possible. Thanks to all of you, and I look forward to seeing many of you on the next webinar as we continue the conversation on these important issues. I hope everyone has a wonderful day or a wonderful night as appropriate wherever you are.